Hello everybody, this is Lucy English here, Professor in Creative Writing at Bath University and one of the Mix Conference organisers. I'm going to be introducing this curation of poetry films, which has been specially put together for the Mix Conference. The theme of this curation is amplified voices, and we have been looking at unusual different approaches to the creation of poetry film, and also the showcasing of underrepresented voices in the whole field of poetry film. The two curators are Adrian Earle and Sarah Tremlett, and they will both say something about who they are and their involvement with poetry film, and also why they have chosen these particular films for this particular curation. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Adrian Earle. I am a poet and filmmaker and thingmaker. Gosh, if I had a notable CV, I'd probably have a longer introduction, but I don't. So, yeah, I make things, and some of those things are poetry films. Yeah, so my curation was focused a little bit more on the amplification of poetries and narratives that have kind of been buried by time and society, and bringing them to the fore and giving us the chance to kind of consider them anew. Almost on the action of the amplified voice. So a poetry film that finds ways to take narrative, take poetics, sidelined either societally or via just time and space, and kind of bring them to the fore, kind of amplify them again so we can hear them, recognize them, and kind of understand them.
Hello, I'm Sarah Tremlett, and I'm co-director of Liberated Words with Lucy. I've also just had a book published, The Poetics of Poetry Film, with leading poetry filmmakers discussing poetry film and form, with large sections by Thomas Sandegiacomo Del Bel and Charles Olson, amongst other artists, giving their views on how to make a poetry film. Yeah, I decided for this curation to pick financially and economically silenced voices of our ecosystem that we're part of, and thinking about how that's represented in poetry film in an aesthetic way. Climate change is happening very fast, so I'd like to think there's something that can be said by poetry filmmakers on this subject, and that's why I've chosen these films today.
Yeah, it's essentially a translation of a 2,000-year-old Kemet poem, so an ancient Egyptian poem that is originally called the Flower Song. And it is beautiful and romantic and sensual and completely forgotten. We have no idea about the full poem or the full context, but the filmmaker Jack Jewers, as part of his really, really cool project called Inverse, found ways to kind of bring these poems that were kind of lost in the canon and recontextualize them with poetry film, very modern, very high production poetry film that kind of brings new life to these works in ways that I would never have considered possible. If I'm going to talk about the things that made it stand out, I like film that has a kind of almost like a performative conceit in it. So the performative conceit in The Lovers is that all of the lovers, the couples that you see on screen, are all actors who've never met each other before. So they're all performing for the first time in each other's presence. And they were simply asked to show elevating degrees of affection leading towards a kiss.
And I'd say, standing there tall in the shadows,
it works beautifully. It works beautifully, and it pulls so much of what is in that original work in terms of how the original poem, or Jack feels the original poem was designed to make you feel, and puts that on the surface. It brings it back to the surface like old love. It's also really beautifully soundtracked with a cello rendition of a Lennon track. So,
I wish I were the
that's a vibe for me. What did you think?
I really love the universality of it. The filmmaker had chosen so all different
With your
types of
hand
people
in
to be
mine, your
represented
love would be
as
returned.
couples, and
I
I
implore my
really like
heart,
that,
if my
and
true
some of
love
the
stays
pairings
away
were quite
tonight,
surprising.
I shall be like
And I
someone
also
already in the grave.
I saw the film first
Are you
before
not my
reading
health
how old the
and
poem
my
actually
day?
was. And I really love the idea about these words transcending time, because I thought, oh, this is sort of like a 15th century poem or something, 16th century poem. Then I found out it's been written sort of 2,000 years ago, and it makes you realise actually humans are humans. That even 2,000 years ago, we were still humans. We still had all the feelings and all the responses that we've got now, and I really like that film really explored
I
that.
think what he seems to be going for in both the films is like an inclusive camera. It's like a camera that gets these very candid moments that they didn't seem cheesy, really. I mean, I think he overcame that somehow. I don't know why he didn't pick people who really were in couples, because maybe that wouldn't have been. I mean, I don't know. You did think they were in couples, I think. I think this focusing really in on the detail, and that makes a lovely contrast with the period of time that's elapsed. So he seems to like to take a long period of time and then really hone in on an instant, doesn't he? Exactly.
Maybe. I quite like the detail, like his camera work. Like it really works to kind of like draw you into the moment. It really works to get you focused on points of touch, on texture. I should maybe talk about my second film, which is from the same filmmaker, which, yeah. I really enjoyed the Inverse project. I think my limit was the hardest decision I had to make really was which of the films to kind of bring to this conference. And I chose Love Song and The Look because it combines two things that I'm vastly interested in and have kind of informed my own writing quite heavily, which is the idea of celebrance and hedonism and opulence and decadence, but also like the ending of things. It is a kind of a translation of a section of a chapter by Ovid, which is, take care how you look, which is a beautiful kind of garden path sentence because it breaks into both things of take care how you look, as in the opulence and decadence of Rome, but also the concept of envy, the concept of kind of societal pressures either way, and the kind of the political sniping and backstabbing that he was witnessing in kind of Rome. And Rome was forever being decried as the fall of like an empire perpetually falling. So it's kind of entertaining that Ovid was writing at a time where it was like, oh, this is the end times. It's all going to pot. And he's like, well, people before me have said this and people after him said that too. Again, nothing has changed. There are a group of people, myself included, that sees this as this phenomenal march of progress, this kind of open, beautiful expression of individuality. There's other people who would literally look at that and see the end times, and how nothing has changed from Ovid's day in that sense, where like the flamboyance of Roman society was seen both as this great liberating statement, and also, signification of the end by the poor Stoics who were like, more robes in more than one color, everything's going to burn. So, what did you do think?
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because the Romans did have this sense about what was order and what was chaos, and the signifiers of order was the Roman way. If you went against the Roman way, that signified chaos, or you were a barbarian. I love the line in that poem. There are others who praise ancient times. When was this written? When Ovid was writing, there were ancient times, and it just, that line completely took me back. And I thought, oh my God, people are still the same. That we look back and think that's ancient times. He looked back to the sort of classic stories and the legends. And there is always a now. There's always a now. That whatever era you're in, you are experiencing a now in all its diversity and chaos. And, there is the feeling at the moment things are completely falling apart. And quite interestingly, Ovid felt exactly the same.
Closed in. And again, they really trusted that person holding the camera. Everybody included the person, didn't they, when they were dancing? And I thought it's just wonderful if you're a filmmaker, isn't it? To get that moment and to have it recorded in such detail like that and nothing go wrong with the actual filming. The clarity was beautiful. Oh, I know what, the music was quite sad and wistful, quite melancholy. So it was a bit as if this moment's not going to last to me as well.
Yeah, I definitely got that vibe.
Did you get that?
Do you think that enhanced the sort of feeling of end of an era of decadence, of things falling apart, that, here is this celebration, this sort of over the top glamour, that what our understanding of the Roman Empire is that things became more and more decadent and more flamboyant?
I feel like it almost enhanced that sense of duality that I felt in the piece, because for me there was always that constant tug of how two different people could look at that footage and see it in two entirely different ways. And the thing that I loved about it is that even I'm looking at that and feeling wistful and realizing that wistfulness is the idea that kind of level of exuberance that is actually under threat. It could be the end of an era for that particular form of expression. It's almost like that form of expression, that form of flamboyance is almost like going out with a bang. And with some people, that could be perceived as, it's all going too far and it must end soon. It's all going too far, so therefore it's the end of something. There is also that reading of it's all gone so beautifully well that this must be the end. This must be the last hurrah. And there is very much that feeling, particularly with the state of the world, and not just the individual politics of expression and the individual policies of expression, but also the literal sense of we've had 2 years. I think this will be the second year of Pride, where the idea of meeting in person and having a parade it's not physically possible. It's not doable. It's not safe for reasons fully outside of the reasons Pride was created for. It's just not safe for human beings to kind of connect together in the same way.
It is funny how we're viewing things through this filter of the pandemic, actually, that if we'd seen this film 2 years ago, that message of things ending and things finishing might not have been so clear. That we are now viewing the world post-pandemic, or even in middle of pandemic. I mean, it hasn't finished yet.
It's a great idea to polarize, and sort of juxtapose these elements and see how wonderfully they work. It's fun. It must be fun for him, really. Even if the ultimate story you're telling is slightly, worrying.
Third film is 1 Minute, and it's by Vanessa Kisuule and Sari Alka. Vanessa Kisuule is the poet, a poet who I have a lot of love for. Her mode of writing is very ripe for this. She tends to have a way of focusing on almost like the gaps in between.
60 seconds. It's harder than I thought.
She's the kind of poet that if she'd be writing about comic books, she'd dedicate a poem to kind of that white panel in between frames. She always pays attention to the gaps. And 1 Minute is a poem that's very much like that. It focuses on the 1 minute of dilated time of uncertainty for a young protagonist holding a pregnancy test. All the thoughts flowing through her head in that 1 minute. One of the things I love about this is I'm a big fan of Tarkovsky, and the way Tarkovsky as a filmmaker just screws with time. Just absolutely, temporality is just out the window with Tarkovsky. And you can spend 15 minutes looking at a one shot and it feels like it's been 5. And at the same time, he can take several seconds and just expand them to like almost half a film's worth. And this is very similarly the same. It's called 1 minute and it focuses on 1 minute of time. but the poem's 4 minutes and 17 seconds long. So you create this dilation. So it's far, like you literally this thing where you're like, you know, it's a minute, but it's also far longer than any minute has any right to be, which is so clever, so perfect for putting the listener in that moment of experiencing it. It's a proper kind of show, don't tell, which is kind of like the first, the first commandment of filmmaking, really.
I love it that we have all these imagined, that what she does is we have these imagined versions, because we never know at the end whether or not the pregnancy test is positive or negative. So and I thought, oh, I really love that it ends like that there isn't a conclusion, that what spins off in our minds is that she could be pregnant, then what? Or she isn't pregnant, and then what? It's a narrative that continues, and I think that's really clever to set that up.
24 seconds.
I think there's something particularly beautiful about poetry that's in medias res, because what we are doing when we write is effectively trying to kind of set in amber things that are often intangible. So, moments of time, sets of emotion, concepts that are far bigger than you could actually fit on a page if you were really thinking about it. And this kind of does that quite well without being like, I'm trying to pack a really big thing into a really small space. It just kind of does. And it does it by kind of leaving a lot unsaid and letting you kind of go, oh yeah, there are these hugely bifurcating paths going off into infinity of what could happen and what brought her to this point and all the things that could bring her out at this point. And instead you just get that focused moment.
I love the relatability of it. I mean, there's, I know what this feels like. I've been there. I've been a young girl sitting in that toilet with my pregnancy test, and I think that there are many young girls or women that have been in that position.
Yeah.
Oh my God, is my life going to change?
Very, very many. I'm absolutely sure, but very few poems. And I think that's another thing that really caught my eye with this. That I was thinking, that's a thing. And it just kind of like trickled into the back of her head. I was like, well, of course, you probably haven't heard poems like that before, because maybe it's just not your demographic. Maybe it's just, my maleness showing. Maybe I haven't paid attention to poems in that vein before. So I'm actually actively looking, and no, it's like Vanessa kind of done it again, where she focuses on these moments that other people go, oh, maybe I'll put a bit of that in, but I won't pay attention to that as a unit of time, as a unit of space in of itself.
All about how this moment affects the future.
And yeah, it's a vibe. And Zoyalka is fast becoming one of my kind of favorite indie filmmakers. She has an intention to kind of detail in space and action and color and how light works and how to make something feel simultaneously unreal but also entirely natural. That's a real vibe for me. That way of taking a moment and bringing you in and making you feel like you're comfortable there, like you're invited into it. That's continued in so much of her work, and 1 Minute with Vanessa. That's a really good example of that. So, okay. Final poem then is Carved in Mayhem, a short film by and written by a very interesting human, Johnny Bang Riley, described as a transient poet and MMA fighter and performer. I have a lot. I have a lot that I can say about this work. It speaks to me particularly because of its proximity to the kind of spoken word that I'm used to. Also to its almost Hemingway-ish modern day equivalent of like poking at the bones of masculinity in this kind of very stoic fashion and playing with that proximity to kind of violence and almost the toxicity of it, but then pulling back and kind of giving something a little bit more meaningful. I like Carved in Mayhem as a poem. As a film, I love it though, and I love it particularly because the attention of the filmmaker Dan DeFelice and creating something that just has such aesthetic weight to it. That perpetual metaphor that, you know, of the carver that literally through strikes, through violence, creates beauty from a raw and formed material. That's this kind of like long running metaphor throughout the piece. It's just, yeah, it's, for me, it's like, there, that is good. I'm happy with this.
I love that celebration of that classic image of masculinity. There were all these sort of clips of these classic Greek statues and the sort of male torso and just the sort of physical beauty of that, and how that can be celebrated in a non-toxic way. I mean, the way that the Greeks put up that sort of, you know, nude male figure as the pinnacle of human achievement, and maybe now we're moving, you know, we've been embarrassed about saying that. It's so loaded that, you know, this is the ideal. I like the way that film explored that, and also showed that there is beauty in the male form, and we can celebrate that without embarrassment or being clouded or without an agenda.
Very much so. Well, one of the things I found most interesting about particularly Riley's work in connection to this is that, I mean, I might not agree with everything he says. I'm always very wary of poet prophet. So his work can be very profound and very, very engaging, and his ideas can be exceptional. I compare him to Hemingway with a degree of kind of like honesty there, in the same way I love Hemingway's work. Yeah, we have a lot to say about the man, but there is that idea that for him, for Johnny, the idea of that pinnacle of physical perfection and the form of physical perfection was almost like a metaphor for his perfecting and refining the mental state required to get there. So it's like dealing with the body in order to kind of purify and refine the mind, which again, it's that.
And he has made himself into a legend. That there's that, you know, he has actually taken his own body, his own life, and hacked that, you know, just physically shaped it.
With the black and white, the strong black and white images, and sometimes like at the end, he was punching, but he was going backwards. That was a really beautiful shot. There were some beautiful shots, but I thought that the way he spoke, often it was quiet and it was often in rhymed verse. It wasn't just being shouted with anger. It was quite studied, I felt, you know, and it was lovely, that contrast. I was really trying to pick up on the very clever rhyming he had at some point. So it was similar to Why I Write by Kostel Kiev, which wasn't as beautifully shot, I would say, but was another story, although in fact he is struggling because he was in prison and was then, the Americans extradited him, this guy who was brought up in a refugee camp, but his was all about facing the camera. And he had a mic and a red cross tape. The tape of the mic was on his chest, and he had a red tape there. So the whole thing is in black and white, but for this red tape. So that's very strangely symbolic film, that one as well. But he was more angry, you know, obviously, and it was a different approach to that subject. So it's quite nice to compare those two films, actually, in a way.
Yeah, very much so. That hadn't occurred to me until you kind of both of those two very particular approaches to rage. The thing that I liked about Garden Mayhem particularly was its control. Johnny as a person and as a poet is somebody who's moved beyond violence, moved beyond rage to the point where it's almost like, you know, how kind of like the warrior poet archetype, where it's like I no longer need to be part of the battles. I am like, the battle ballads are about me, sort of thing. Like I've moved to that point now where I can exist in the narrative of it instead of the thick of it, and that study and that kind of like studied weight to how he uses words. He also has I was doing some reading about him. He has this really interesting quote that he mentioned a few times in a few different writings and different podcasts and things like that. And it's like, violent people are poets in motion. And that really kind of like, it connected and vibed with me. That same deliberate, structured, focused and intentional use of language towards a goal is what we do as poets. And he perceived, and his kind of like weird epiphany was that the violence that was visited upon him and the violence that he understood could be transferred into poetics, because to him a violent person was somebody who used structured, managed, fact with a focused purpose. And it's like, I can shift that, and he almost like pouring all of that focus and energy into a different form, and that was the result. So I'm very interested in him and his work. And Dan DeFelice, if you do get a chance to just check out his work outside of this, I just think it's phenomenal. He's a very, very good visual storyteller.
My first film is Construction Site by Gwendolyn Audrey Foster. And in fact, it's a film poem. It doesn't have any verbal language. But of course, there's the audio visual language that's going on during the film. When she makes her films and puts them on Vimeo, the description that's below qualifies what she's showing. She's an eco-feminist, makes sort of experimental, surreal films. And so this film has a political structure, really, to why she did what she did. And I have sort of briefly interviewed her on this. But essentially what you see are like long stretches of landscape, say, with very little editing. So basically that essential process is about man as a human not interfering. It's replicating the idea of not interfering within our ecosystems. This was a point that I put to her, and she said, yes, that's why she was doing that. And often she'll have very long, it might be a minute of just flowing across a landscape. And in this film, that was counterpointed by the construction site, the sounds of the building work, and which gives it a really unsettling feeling, because you're seeing beautiful images and close-ups of flowers and so on, but you're hearing this construction, the digger, etc. And so it's an unsettling film, and it's making a point. I mean, she says that that nature, the environment or the ecosystems look back at us, and that our screens are a philosophical space for talking about that. It gives a space somehow for thinking about. I don't want to say nature, but it's really about our space within the biosphere. And that's really what all of these films I'm showing, really talking and saying, giving voice to what effectively we take for granted, really.
I thought it was quite interesting that film, she actually used recycled images and sounds, that she sourced those images. I thought I found this film actually really moving. I found the juxtaposition of the sort of crunching and those metallic sounds of the construction equipment and these landscapes. It was sort of like a horrible warning. This could all go. All this beautiful nature can be dug up and turned into a car park. It's like it really affected me, rather than, and also because it was actually wordless, wasn't it? There were no words, and to be immersed in those images and that constant grating sound, I was very moved.
I was going to say that, I loved it. I really loved it, and I loved it because at first it was absolutely disorientating. And then maybe after the second or third watch through, I kind of had this slightly epiphanic moment where I realized that the juxtaposition that I was kind of finding so grating was actually only an apparent juxtaposition, because the construction and destruction present in the audio is also represented in the imagery. It's just at a natural, like, rather than androcentric timescale. Like, we are still seeing nature breaking itself down and rebuilding itself. It's just that it doesn't make the same racket that we do when we are forcing our environment to change.
Fish prints. Tell me about fish prints.
Fish Prints is an extraordinary film, which I think I saw first at Weimar. I think it was there. I felt it was, one of the best films there, really. I just thought it was so fresh and so instinctive in its construction. But essentially, Shifra Soria Huel is her name. She's at the Gerrit Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam, which I think says a lot about that academy. I'd be really keen to go there, quite honestly. And she begins with a fable. She likes the idea of using fables. This was a Grimm's fairy tale. And then she kind of just rehacks it around. Yet the underlying theme is, of course, our consumer, the role of the consumer. You might not want to go about it. You wouldn't think that, well, you'd go about it the way that she has, which is to make you laugh in a sort of dark way. And the music, she's also a musician, and she plays a trumpet. And I find the music is so strong and so potent in this. It's so anarchic and funny and witty yet. It's a stroke of genius, really. Yeah, in the film, she actually edits out the wife, the wife that asks the fisherman for all she desires, and the fisherman becomes a woman who's pushing the trolley around the supermarket.
And the people chopping up the food and dismantling, pulling the fish apart. I thought it was absolutely bonkers. And I thought to myself, I want to see more poetry films like this justice celebration. I mean, poetry film can be quite precious, can be quite sort of, emotional. And I just love this explosion. Yeah. I had no clue what was going on. I didn't relate it at all to that fable. Is sometimes called The Fisherman's Wife, isn't it, of that particular fairy tale. And it was, I mean, I will say this, it was like watching the Ringing Singing Tree, where you're watching something and you don't really understand the story. It's like, what is going on here? And pushing the woman, the fishwoman through the supermarket. I absolutely loved it. I love that, the dancing, the colours, those sort of eye-stinging colours, and also, I mean, the supermarkets are like this, aren't they? They're really bright-coloured. They're full of sort of buy me sort of products. I sort of felt there was some message there about consumerism.
Oh yeah, totally.
And, definitely.
I got that, I think, and there was some message there about sort of chopping up nature and turning it into a product. That's what I got from it.
It was having this sort of engaging approach of a really a dark subject.
And quite tongue-in-cheek and very playful.
Yes.
Very, like kids dressing up. And almost when kids dress up, they still know that their kids dressed up.
Yeah. The thing that drew me to this verse, it's got, this might not make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, I will try and explain it more. But it has a deeply internet aesthetic to it. Mm-hmm. This idea that, like, none of this is real, this is all performance, and we are deliberately going over the top. It's kind of like anarchic absurdism about very serious things. Like, we will never take anything literally, but or seriously, but this is an incredibly serious thing. Like, in the future, there will be like pre-meme and post-meme as like the idea of the meme. Because once we've gotten to this point now where kind of over the top absurdism, mashing together kind of like cultural reference points into like new forms of meaning. Like you can smash together a fable with like a parody of Lidl and make it about anti-consumerism and driving an eco message. You can do all of those things over what is effectively like rhyme, trumpet music at 200 miles per hour, and all of it is brilliant, and I'm there for it.
It was like a Split Bang advert. It had that, or sort of. Have you ever watched television in somewhere like Taiwan? It's almost impossible to watch. There's always like somebody jumping around a little bunny in the corner or something, or a sort of frame that's, and it's like you're watching the news. You know, it's really got a little bunny in the corner, and it's like, what is happening? I take on board what you're saying about an internet aesthetic.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's like what I mean about this like whole idea of like that very meme aesthetic. Like everything is frivolous, but also nothing is frivolous. Everything's so deliberate. All the choices, colours, all the actions, everything has been chosen. It looks like chaos, but it isn't. It's almost like, again, it's this internet aesthetic. It's like people recreating like the busy MySpace pages as like an art aesthetic. It's like a thing back in the day, that idea of like deliberately creating something very meticulously that looks like glitter fired out of a cannon. And I'm absolutely here for it.
There was all that thing in lockdown, wasn't it? People recreating scenes from films.
Yes.
Scenes from films with the dog, or the cat. I thought that was wonderful, and I love that sort of spontaneous thing that happens in social media. That you get people doing voiceovers for things and juxtaposing things. It's a sort of creative randomization.
Brilliant. I think she's going to do. I'll be very interested to see her next film. And for me, again, I just love the music. I love what she did with the music, and I think it makes it. Rain Frog Promise. I really would like you to talk to me about like what drew you to this, because I have very many thoughts on it. I mean, Mariel, Dr. Mariel Land, she actually does go and work as a photographer, often with, endangered species, or she gets close to actually working with birds or animals, and writes about this. And essentially, she's her work's influenced by biophilia. It's this phrase and term which is she's written quite a bit about the biosphere. Let's keep calling it the biosphere, because nature is such a difficult term. A bit like the previous film, she does take myths and legends often, and this one is Rain Frog Promise is involved with the ibis.
Also, when you mentioned biophilia, I couldn't not think of the Bjork album, which is amazing. There was an entire age of biophilia that she was writing, and she was writing very much about the similar point that during the Icelandic financial crisis, she was writing about consumerism and nature and economies and human weight and what we were doing to certain ecospheres. So that's the first time I ever heard the phrase biophilia. So it's really interesting to kind of hear it again in this context with a similar kind of but much more focused saying to it.
I've seen quite a few of Mariel films, and I love her aesthetic. I love that dreamy, sort of beautiful changing shapes. And she does this sort of whispery voiceover. There's something quite, I would say, magical, the sort of magical setting, like, an incantation. To me, it's got a very strong feminine aesthetic. And, we're thinking of magic, thinking of fairyland, thinking of sort of wise women. I sometimes find her films difficult to understand. But to me, sometimes when I watch poetry films, it's almost like sometimes when you read a poem, you think, I don't get this, but I'm still getting something from it. And I get a lot from watching her films, even though I don't necessarily understand the thinking and the story behind them, because I get very drawn in to the actual, just the little world of that film. And she definitely has got a very strong world that she creates.
Yeah, she's influenced by the Curation story of a scarlet ibis who rebuilt the world, but she's trying to bring knowledge around the ibis as well. And she says she's fascinated by these stories and the interdependencies that the stories work through. There's that kind of strange half world, that's very that draws you in. I mean, almost in the opposite way to Schiffer's work.
Yes.
They're two sides of the same coin in a funny way.
I mean, sometimes thinking about like somebody like David Lynch, the filmmaker David Lynch. Is this real? Is this a dream? Is this really happening? And even what is happening? That I get that same feeling watching her films. That almost like that state in between being awake and being asleep.
Then, of course, there's my film with Caleb Parkin, who describes himself as a day-glow, queero, eco-poet. In a way, he's kind of researching, isn't he, what it is to have a queer eco-poetics, which I think will develop through time, through all of his great poetry. But a lot of that is to do with bringing up the materiality of a non-dualist eye and a non-dualist positioning of the poet and also the filmmaker through the sort of materiality of things. He's quite visceral about how I think his poetry is quite visceral. And I managed to get some very good footage, which was some sort of training video from probably the 1930s or 40s of something being swallowed and you watching it go down through the body. And then this was set in the centre of the film. And meanwhile, his words became, the poem was called I Swallow, but it's to do with flies on a bike ride, swallowing flies on a bike ride. And so the words of the poem just inevitably became flies in a sense. The words, they kind of dance around the central square, which is the man on the bike. We think of flies, we bat them away, but we're all in the same biosphere. And giving some importance to the flies is, through poetry, I think, is a very clever way of renegotiating this, the androcentric position.
Lovely following flies. I mean, in a way that's revolting, but also quite intriguing. It's sort of like, I love the idea of sort of cycling through this sort of fly swarm, and there's nothing you can do just apart from sort of gulp it in, because you need to gulp in air, and with the air comes flies. I love that sort of animated, the archive footage of the person swallowing all the little pointers, sort of teeth, tongue.
It's funny, isn't it? You can talk more and more about, I think, this. Sorry, I shouldn't keep talking about it, but it is our obsession with ourselves, isn't it? Human beings, we're just so obsessed with ourselves and keeping ourselves straight on the straight and narrow, but we're not thinking at all about the bigger picture.
I love Caleb's poetry. He's really good at writing. I mean, almost a bit like Vanessa Casuli, about writing about funny little moments. Sort of moments that you would make a poem.
Yeah, expanding fragments into kind of like greater connected points of being. Like I absolutely vibe with it. The one thing that I did find with this, I felt like a screen limited it. Like I wanted to see this projected on a wall in a space where I could stand in front of it, and when a verse appeared above me, I'd have to physically move my head you know what I mean? Like I'd have to actually experience it at its full size, because there's a projectionist who I've worked with, Kirsten Adkins. So yeah, she's a projectionist. She's a filmmaker and a projectionist, and her films are designed to be seen on these huge textural scales. And I had the pleasure of kind of performing to one of her works. So I wrote and recorded a poem, and then she made a film to that poem, and then I performed the poem on film as that film was projected at me, and that was a vibe.
Did you feel like it was engulfing you then?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was just like, I am part of a larger whole here. This is what's happening. This is how it's
Tonight is for the Trees is by poet Sasha Patterson. She's Canadian. And the filmmaker is Matthew Hayes. And I spoke to Matthew Hayes about this. It is quite an old film. And it arose from a project. And essentially, it's unlike all the other films because it doesn't really deal with the aesthetics of the screen, how you might manipulate the screen to create a non-dualist sense of being connected to the biosphere. It just simply presents her in front of trees. Yet I think that her delivery gives you a real sense of her, the need to be connected to the biosphere.
I mean, there's something about just filming somebody reading or performing a poem that seems apparently artless. And I think that I like the sort of honesty of that approach.
I kind of had a lot of love for this. I had a lot of love for it for 2 reasons. One, it felt instantly familiar from the work that I usually see.
Tonight is for the
It's
cool
a spoken
breeze that
word
brushes
film.
their bark like
But it was
nips on
different
sun-kissed
enough
cheeks,
in the
leaves
sense that
falling
while
gently to
ostensibly
the
being
ground, just a
it's
few,
ostensibly a list
scattered
poem,
here
right?
and there like the
But
lone strands of hair found in the bed
it's a list
sheets,
poem
the
that kind of
traces your
acts as a
presence bring
reintegration.
smile to my face.
So it's almost like a
Tonight is for the
reintegration of
alley
humanity
cats
back
that
into the
jump from
natural.
fence to roof,
The idea
maples
of
that
like
line the paths touching tips of twigs,
Spoken word is
bridges
slammy.
that to ride under. Tonight is for the thunder.
That poetry slam, you've got to win. You've got to fast and furious because you're trying to win points. And if you see a lot of it, it becomes very repetitious and also mannered.
You might say that again, she seems to be utterly have an authentic voice, and it's so hard, isn't it? I think it must be so hard to deliver a poem where you're full of the love of something. It's not fashionable, perhaps, or like you say, you just got to slam through something. She's not. She's saying, "Well, look, this is. Why don't you look at this? This is fantastic. This is what's making life on this planet. It's wonderful. She is kind of wonder, and that is very hard to do, I think, myself.
I like the authenticity too, because I think that we're used to polished, we're used to sort of, staged, we're used to managed, all these things. And what you said earlier about unfashionable, that there wasn't, this is not a fashionable poetry film. Not a fashionable piece of spoken word, but actually that was something about it that I liked. I like that sort of, she's saying what she really feels,